warm UT welcome to Mansoor.
Well, thanks. That was a very kind introduction. And I really appreciate you all turning out, overflow crowd. So the biggest crowd ever for one of these lectures, from what I've heard. And millions more watching online, right? You finally caught that. I'm going to speak for about 30-45 minutes and then open it up to questions. The Q&A on these talks is usually the most interesting part. But what I'm going to talk to you about is the history of the war on terror from my standpoint, and a little bit about the Iraq War, which I think plays heavily into what's happening in the Middle East today. And then talk a little bit about what's happened recently in the Trump administration. So off we go. All right, so what's gone right ever since the attack on 9/11? There have been successes in the war on terror. You have to admit there's been no repeat of an attack on the scale of 9/11. And that was the big worry of the Bush administration, that terrorists would get a hold of weapons of mass destruction and that they'd be able to cause even more devastation in America or in the countries of our allies were they to do that. And that has not happened. They haven't been able to repeat the attacks of 9/11. Aircraft have been hardened, cockpits have been hardened, air travel is safer. As much as we love to hate the TSA, my colleague John Mueller at Ohio State, who's now emeritus, would argue that actually we can do away with the TSA, that passengers defending their own airplanes, along with armed cockpits, is all we need to make air travel safer. But be that as it may, our air travel is safe. It's also a lot more complicated and there's a lot of hassles involved, but that might be the place for security. Our homeland defenses have been vastly strengthened. There is a Department of Homeland Security that is coordinating various aspects of homeland security. It is harder for would-be terrorists to get into the United States. They're vetted much more carefully, regardless of what this administration says. It's very, very difficult to get in. You have to have a visa if you're from a suspect country, and you get vetted pretty thoroughly. And so the terror attacks that have occurred here have not occurred because people are coming in from the outside bent on damage and destruction the way they were before 9/11. And finally, we killed the mastermind of 9/11. And brought him to justice, I think deservedly so. And so that we have to, I think, certainly put on the side of what's gone right. But what's gone wrong? And there's plenty on this side of the ledger as well. 9/11 began with an attack on the United States by Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is still in existence. We killed the dead, but someone else, stepped up, and they're still in existence, although they're under severe pressure in their sanctuaries, in the federal administrative tribal areas in Uzbekistan. They're still around, and they still have affiliates around the world that swear allegiance to them. And so we have not been able to finish the fight against Al-Qaeda. And maybe it was never really realistic to finish the fight against Al-Qaeda. But they are still in existence. The second thing I would point out, I think this is probably the biggest grand strategic mistake the United States has made in the war on terror in the last 100, 200 years, was the Iraq War. In my view, it was strategically misguided, poorly executed, and ended prematurely. Now, I know some of you might disagree with the last statement there. People certainly didn't want to stay around in Iraq, but one of the great things I've discovered during my transition from being a military officer to being a civilian academic is it no longer matters whether or not that I'm right because I have tenure. We're going to talk more about the Iraq War in a couple of slides. The third thing I would point out is something that began in the Bush administration, but really came to full fruition in the Obama administration. And this is the substitute of drone strikes and special forces raids for a holistic strategy on combating terror and for dealing with states that might be failed or failing. These safe havens that have developed around the world for terrorists to set up base camps and so forth. It's like mowing the grass. You can kill a bunch of terrorists, but the grass is more will creep up behind them. The grass is still going to grow. And in some cases, the drone strikes will do more harm than good because there's a lot of pushback from the local civilian population. Even though you might hit the right targets, you're still killing people in their midst, and they don't like that. And you may be making the problem worse. But the Obama administration simply did not want to do more in terms of dealing with the roots of terror than this, at least from a military point of view. It viewed the war as a long-term ideological struggle, if you will, one that had to be resolved within Islam. But that doesn't do much for the security of the West in the interim. The fourth thing is the effect of the Arab Spring, which began with so much promise and has really panned out in only one nation, and that's Tunisia, which is somewhat promising, but has got its problems as well. But Libya, Syria, Yemen are all basket cases, failed or failing states, where our intervention or lack thereof, and you have really an example of all three things here: intervention in Libya, a pseudo-intervention in Yemen, and no intervention in Syria, and in each case, the policy has failed. And that has created enormous problems around the region and that are impacting our allies in Europe. We'll discuss that. The rise of ISIS, which I'll discuss in further detail. The most heavily armed, best financed, most powerful terrorist group in the world today, with deep tentacles into various states around the region and even into the United States and our European allies as well via the internet. And then finally, lone wolf attacks, which we haven't had a repeat of 9/11, but we have had mass murder in San Bernardino, in Orlando, in Paris, in Brussels, elsewhere. That's needs inspired by terrorist groups, by ISIS, and their radical Islamist ideology. And let me just clarify, I use the term Islamist as in the perversion of Islam for political purposes. So that's how I'm referring to that term. I'm not using the term Islamic. So Islamist terrorism. And this has created a sense of insecurity in the United States, obviously. So
I don't want to make a scene.
electoral process. I think, I'm a military historian. Every military historian has to have at least one quote by Karl von Clausewitz, the foremost philosopher of war. You have to recognize the kind of war that you're engaging in. Otherwise, you're not going to win. And I think this was our problem early on after 9/11, the Bush administration. They simply didn't understand the kind of war that we were fighting. They tried to turn it into something that was more amenable to the means at our disposal, which is military action. So let's get into the Iraq War. Like I said, probably the greatest strategic blunder in the United States history in recent memory for sure. And you have to go back a good long way to find something comparable. The idea was that we would go in, take out the Ba'athist regime of Saddam Hussein, and turn Iraq over to a small group of emigres who would come back and take over the government, and then we'd leave. And that didn't work out all that great. What we did was we opened a Pandora's box of problems that we didn't foresee because we didn't really understand Iraqi history, Iraqi culture, the schism in Islam between Sunnis and Shia, and how this might play out once the government was deposed. Governments being there to keep a lid on violence, among other things. So we had no long-term strategy for dealing with the insecurity that we had created within Iraq. We had no fundamental understanding of counterinsurgency, of stability operations. We thought we could go in with a very high-tech, small army by all comparisons. If you compare what we used in Desert Storm, for instance, more than 600,000 troops to fewer than 200,000 that we used in the Iraq War for a much more expansive mission. It wasn't just kicking the Iraqi army out of Kuwait, it was basically regime change, destroying the entire Iraqi military apparatus and then replacing it with a regime more amenable to our interests. And so we had a lack of resources to achieve those goals as well. And this created issues that got worse as time went on. And on top of that, our policies created pushback, de-Baathification that went far too deep, disbanding the Iraqi army, which created losers. And this created the military and political basis for the insurgency. These people who are now on the outside looking in, who felt that they had no stake in the new Iraq, and they simply weren't going to give up. And they instead turned to force of arms to change the dynamic on the ground, and that is still playing out today. The Iraq War, although we left in 2011 and we're now back, never ended for these people. And that's what you have to realize, because the rise of ISIS happened in the midst of this milieu. And ISIS has taken advantage of the situation on the ground, the feeling of the Sunni Arabs that they have been abused by the government in Baghdad, that we not only took power away from them, but then made it impossible for them to share in the power and resources of Iraq going forward. There was a brief period after the surge where this was not the case. We'll talk about that in a second. But initially, what we thought was that we could simply implant democracy into Iraq, and that would take care of things, that people would vote for their leaders, they'd have a stake in the government then, and things would be okay. This really ignores the fundamental basis for a democratic form of government, and that is the ability of all sides to come to agreement that whatever government is elected is a government for all people, and that minority rights would be somewhat respected. This is not the case in Iraq, and not the case in much of the world outside of the West, and it's in other places such as Japan. But in Iraq, there's very little history, if any, of democracy. No respect really for minority rights. No freedom of the press. No freedom of religion to speak of, really. If you think there is, then try to convert from Islam to Christianity. No freedom of assembly. And so all the fundamental basis of democracy didn't exist. And what happened in the elections of 2005, all those purple figures and thumbs in the air that we were celebrating, is it really made the Sunnis fearful. They knew they would be outvoted, and therefore they would lose power. And so they simply didn't vote. They opted out of the political process, and they doubled down on the insurgency. And this led eventually to civil war. And the civil war was triggered by the bombing of the Al-Askari Shrine, the Golden Dome Mosque in Samarra, in February 2006, which unleashed ethno-sectarian violence across Iraq, especially in Baghdad. And it was pretty clear to those of us looking at the situation dispassionately that we were well on our way to losing the war in Iraq. And it's at this point where President Bush decided to grasp the reins of power and overrule most of his advisors and order the surge of U.S. forces to Iraq. And it was a very gutsy decision. He was sailing against every political breeze blowing against him. Even his own party wanted to find a way out of Iraq and peace with honor, if you will. But instead, he decided that he was in the Iraq War to win it, and that he would double down, in his words, in General Petraeus' words, go all in his attempt to do so. The most important thing here, though, is not the addition of extra reinforcements to Iraq, it's the fact that they would be used differently in accordance with the new counterinsurgency doctrine that I helped edit at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And its cornerstone was that killing bad guys is not how you end insurgencies. You end it by co-opting or controlling the population. We had to get out of our big bases among the people in order to do this. And I go into this in some detail because when we look at the war against ISIS going forward, we have to look about what succeeded in the past. Why is ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, no longer called Al-Qaeda in Iraq? It's because the latter group was defeated during the surge by co-opting the Sunni Arab population and turning it against Al-Qaeda. And this is what happened during the surge. The surge is initiated right here at the height of the ethno-sectarian violence. More than 3,500 Iraqis being killed every month in December 2006 to ethno-sectarian violence. And if you put that on the scale of the US population, it would be like 35,000 Americans being killed every month to politically motivated violence. You can see what that would happen in our society if that were happening. And that's what was ripping Iraq apart. So we slid sideways while the surge brigades were brought in, and then we began Operation Phantom Thunder, the surge of offensive operations, in June of 2007, and you have a radical drop in violence. A little uptick during the surge of the Knights, Nouri al-Maliki's expedition down to Basra to defeat the Jaysh al-Mahdi, and then it goes all the way down to the end of the surge, where the level of violence is at the same point it was when Saddam Hussein was captured. And in both cases, there was the possibility for political outreach to the Sunnis. It wasn't grabbed there, it was grabbed here. And that had a significant impact on Iraq. The Sunnis decided to become part of the solution again. Our outreach to them was basically, you become part of the political process. Vote. Form political parties. And we'll intercede with you to make sure that you're treated fairly. And we'll be here for the long haul, and you'll have your share of power and resources. You won't be in charge, probably, but you'll be treated fairly. And the Sunnis bought into that. And they helped us defeat Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Violence went way down. They voted in the elections of 2009 and 2010 in even greater numbers than the Shia and the Kurds. So they were all in on the political aspects of governing Iraq going forward. So what happened? Well, we have a tale of two presidents with two different visions of Iraq. George Bush, who said his vision of Iraq was like South Korea. And I was in on these National Security Council meetings, and I heard him say this. And what he meant is that, for several decades after the Korean War, Korea was not a great democracy, it wasn't a great economy, but it was held together by the presence of US forces. And eventually it became a real democracy with a vibrant economy, an Asian tiger, and it was the stability that the United States provided that allowed that to happen. That was his vision for Iraq. But that was not his successor's vision for Iraq. Barack Obama looked at Iraq through the lens of the Vietnam War, the strategically misguided conflict that the United States needed to get out of as soon as it could. And the Status of Forces Agreement, which said that US forces needed to withdraw at the end of 2011, was his way out. In negotiating a successor agreement, he simply put too many conditions on the Iraqis for them to agree to have US troops remain. And that created real problems internally in Iraq. although the Sunnis had returned to the political arena and voted in huge numbers in the elections of 2010. In fact, their candidate, Ayad Alawi, won that election. They weren't allowed to even attempt to form a government. In the parliamentary system, the party with the most seats in the parliament should have the first shot at forming the government. And that was, in fact, in the Iraqi constitution. And instead, Ayad Alawi was never allowed to even attempt to form a government. And it was the United States that basically pulled the rug out from underneath him. It was our ambassador, Christopher Hill, who convinced the Obama administration that Nouri al-Maliki, the previous prime minister, was our guy, and that we needed to make a better Maliki. These are not my words, I'm not making this up. It's in the New Yorker article that he wrote. We needed to make a better Maliki rather than support the winner of the election. So if you're the Sunnis and you see the United States and Tehran actually agreeing to allow the loser of the election to form a government, what do you think about democracy? Right? You think it's bunk. We agreed to, either they're interlocutor with the Iraqi government to give them a fair shake, and instead, basically, they got screwed. And so Maliki became the prime minister. He governed in a highly divisive and sectarian manner. He jailed political opponents. In the wake of the Arab Spring, he attacked protest camps, Sunni Arab protest camps. He tortured political prisoners and simply made it impossible for the Sunnis to back his government any longer, and they went back into opposition. They're once again alienated from the political system, and this is where the milieu in which ISIS rises up and returns to power. So what is ISIS? It's the successor group to Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which had been all but eviscerated after the surge from 2007 to 2008. The group was never totally defeated. Its bases were in Mosul, and you can see why we're fighting them there right now, and increasingly across the border in Syria, where the Syrian civil war, once it began in 2011, gave them ungoverned space in which they could gain power, adherence, rearm, train, and eventually take control of territory. It's allied with remnants of the defeated Iraqi army, ex-Baathists, that have made common cause with it. It lives among a people who have seen themselves go from being in charge to being out of power. And so it finds ungoverned space in Iraq and Syria with a population that in many cases is generally sympathetic because ISIS promises to put Sunni Arabs back in charge. Of course, ISIS overreaches and quickly becomes unwanted because of how it treats the civilian population. But initially, it had quite a bit of backing from citizens in Mosul and other regions in northwestern Iraq and eastern Syria. And this set the stage for the collapse of the Iraqi army in those areas. ISIS invaded between January and June of 2014. In the meantime, U.S. forces had pulled out of Iraq by the end of 2011. In the 3 years since then, Nouri al-Maliki was more worried about his army launching a coup against him than he was in making sure that the army was capable of defending against a foreign invasion. And so he pulled a lot of the commanders that we had put in place, competent people, but in many cases they're Sunnis. He pulled them out of their commands and packed the military with his political cronies. This is dictatorship 101, coup-proof your army. And when he did this, the people he put in place used the military, their units, as basically cash cows. They would get a lump sum of money to train and clothe their unit and feed it and give their soldiers salaries. And then they would, in fact, pocket a lot of that money. Their soldiers would go without pay. They wouldn't be trained. And even though they were fairly well armed, anyone who knows anything about military history is I'll take an army that's well-trained and has good morale over an army that has good weapons and is not well-trained and well-disciplined and has poor morale any day. And so simply ISIS came over in their pickup trucks, armed with machine guns and so forth, and the Iraqi army, which had wonderful weapons, simply folded. And then ISIS was able to take over Mosul and work its way down the Euphrates and Tigris River valleys towards Baghdad. This brought the Iraqi government to a moment of panic and led Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani to support the creation, basically, of Shiite militias to oppose ISIS. So now you have injected into this state not only the Iraqi armed forces, but this extra judicial military, which has now actually been made part of the government military apparatus with a recent law. And what impact has this had now? ISIS, like I said, is the largest, most heavily armed, most combat experienced, best financed terrorist group in the world today. But it's also a state. It controls territory. It controls a good chunk of Syria and Iraq. Now it's losing that territory as the coalition against it gains ground, but it still is very, very powerful. It has caused a lot of regional instability. Iraq, Syria, it has affiliates around the world, which we'll see in a second here, and it has stoked religious conflict, which is being played out not just in the context of a radical Islamist terrorist group against everyone else, but Saudi Arabia, the supporter of Sunnis in the Arab Islamic world, against Tehran and Iran, which is the supporter of the Shia in the Islamic world. And so you have basically a fight within a fight over who's going to control Islam and who's going to control the Middle East. And of course, its impact on the United States. Massive refugee flows from the Syrian civil war up into Europe, which is causing a destabilization of the governments of our European allies. The number one issue in Brexit was immigration. One of the great issues in our recent election was immigration. One of the great issues in the French election, Marine Le Pen, on the far right, is immigration. And so these massive refugee flows and the unchecked immigration from the Middle East is an issue. It's become a political football, but it is destabilizing various states around the Western world. And I've talked about the instigation of lone wolf attacks, the various mass murders in both the United States and Europe, and the rise of populist political movements. So where is ISIS today? It's in control in the Euphrates River Valley between Raqqa and the Iraqi border. It's fighting an existential battle for it. In Mosul right now, the eastern bank of the Tigris River has now come under control of the Iraqi armed forces, and ISIS has been penned into the western part, the central part of Mosul, and that battle will play out over the next few months. Syria is still in the midst of civil war, although a civil war that it looks like Bashar al-Assad, backed by Russia and Iran, is winning. And you still have massive sectarian violence in Baghdad, fomented by ISIS and Arab Kurd tensions along the Green Line here. Lethal aid pouring in from Iran, which wants to control Iraqi politics. It views a weak and subservient Iraq as in its national interest. And foreign fighter flows, which have been somewhat choked off, which is obviously leading to ISIS, the weakening of ISIS, and recent Turkish military action into the conflict, but more to keep a lid on Kurdish aspirations for an independent state, really, than to do anything about ISIS or the Syrian civil war. ISIS has franchises across North Africa and Nigeria, in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the Caucasus, and of course its homeland in Iraq and Syria. And if it were to be defeated today, it would not disappear. It would simply become a guerrilla movement with guerrilla groups already organizing in Iraq and Syria, and obviously in these other countries as well. And it would become a more virulent terrorist organization as well. It put more of its energies into terrorism rather than focusing on trying to maintain the caliphate, maintain the homeland. The United States, as I said, was not able to stay out of the Iraq War for long. When ISIS threatened the Yazidi people with extinction and enslaved several thousand of their women, the United States re-engaged with an air campaign and then with advisors, and now even with special forces raids. It's been a significant campaign, but one that has had significant restrictions placed on it, and I would suspect that the Trump administration is going to lift a lot of these restrictions. So what am I talking about? So when planning air attacks now, there's a lot of stipulations about the amount of collateral damage that you can cause, the amount of civilian casualties and so forth. Now the law of war doesn't say that if you conduct military operations and you cause civilian deaths, that you're wrong. It says that the advantage gained from, the military advantage gained from combat action has to be commensurate with the amount of civilian deaths and the amount of civilian casualties. And I would suspect that that line is going to be drawn much more on the side of military action in the Trump administration than it has been under the Obama administration. So to date, we've had 17,861 strikes, probably more than that. This is as of early January. That number will probably ramp up fairly significantly. U.S. advisors have been assisting Kurdish Peshmerga, YPG, Kurdish YPG forces in Syria, Syrian Democratic Forces, and the Iraqi Army. In the very last months of the Obama administration, the authority to put those advisors further down at brigade level has been authorized. I suspect that the Trump administration will put advisors down even farther into these organizations. You're going to see more special forces, more advisors at lower levels, which means they're going to have closer contact with the front line and with combat actions. You're going to see more raids. We already saw that. First combat action of the Trump administration was a raid into Yemen to try to take out an al-Qaeda camp. You're going to see more of this. Beyond that, on the outside chance, you might even see the introduction of some U.S. combat formations into the fight against ISIS. Because if you want to take Raqqa and you want to do it quickly, you're not going to do it with the forces on the ground. They're simply not strong enough. You're going to have to introduce more combat power into the region. And so that may be something coming to an administration near you. The Iraqis and Shiite militias have had successes in the war against ISIS. They retook Tikrit, they retook Beji, they retook Ramadi. They're now in a fight for Mosul. I already mentioned the Russian entry into the Syrian civil war, which has tipped the balance in favor of Bashar al-Assad and his forces, and the Turkish entry, more to keep the Kurds at bay than to fight ISIS. Our great ally in this conflict has been Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi, a much more centrist politician than Nouri al-Maliki. And he has a very tenuous hold on power, and we're not making it easy on him at all with our actions. And he's balancing Iranian interests and American interests and the interests of his own constituency, and it's very difficult for him to balance all these interests. And I think it's in our national interest to make sure that he succeeds. But like I said, we're not making it easy for him. His administration administration, really, its fate is staked to the Battle of Mosul. And he initially made claims that they would win it very quickly and very decisively. That has not occurred. Urban combat is much more difficult, especially for an inexperienced army, than almost any other form of warfare. So it's not surprising to me that this battle was not over by the end of last year, and in fact may last into the summer months. Let's hope not. And the Trump administration, so what has it done? Well, not much yet. This was the administration's immigration executive order really was its first piece of policy that it put forward to fight the war on terror. And this is what it does. It suspends refugee admissions for 120 days. It suspends the Syrian refugee program indefinitely. Now think about refugees. They don't come from Australia. Well, actually, they do come from Australia. They don't come from France or Germany. Refugees come from war zones. And if you suspend the refugee program for war zones, basically you're saying we're not going to take refugees. Although he did make an exception. He said, if refugee claims are on the basis of religious persecution, we'll honor those as long as the applicant belongs to a religion that is a minority in their country. Well, since the 7 countries in the band are all Muslim majority, what does this mean? We're going to allow Christians in and we're not going to allow Muslims in. And what does this tell the Arab Islamic world, our supposed allies in the war against ISIS? What does it tell them as far as how we view them? And finally, it reduces the total number of refugees coming to the United States. So what's the problem with this? Temporarily suspend it, relook our vetting process, make America safer, and then 4 months from now, maybe we can open it back up. Well, first, Iraq is one of the countries on the list, and Iraq is our primary ally in the war against ISIS. And we have just told the Iraqis that they're not welcome here. So that is making it difficult for Haider al-Abadi to maintain his status as our ally. In fact, the Iraqi Council of Representatives passed a motion, which is not a law, that said, well, we don't want Americans in our country either. And what would that do to our war effort there? Because a lot of the Americans fighting ISIS are civilian contractors. And if you prevent them from going into Iraq, then you've just hobbled our war against ISIS. And then there's a whole host of problems with the list of countries. None of the perpetrators of major terror attacks in the United States in the past 15 years have come from nations on the list, and those that have perpetrated terrorist attacks in the United States are from countries like Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the Emiratis. They're not on the list. And Americans simply were, I think, dealing with a threat that is pretty small to begin with. I like the statistic that you're 6 times more likely to die from a shark attack. But the bottom line is that the executive order is alienating the very nations that the United States expects to assist it in the war against Islamist extremism. And so I think it's counterproductive. Even if you agree with it, it's counterproductive. I will say that the piece of the executive order is no guarantee against a repeat of the Bowling Green massacre. I was there. It's the score of the state Bowling Green game last fall.
The refs were helping that one too.
So this is my last slide. So what should the war against Islamist extremism look like? That should be a holistic effort that should squeeze them and fight them in with all the various forms of national power. So we have, obviously, there is a military component to this. Special forces raids, drone strikes, airstrikes, advisors, conventional and counter-terrorist force operations, obviously. A huge intelligence portion that supports that with the various forms of intelligence. But then there's a lot of other things. There's diplomacy that works with the various countries in the region to help them with what they need to stabilize their areas and to have them convince their own people that these are groups not worth supporting. And working with a full range of our capabilities, such as in the internet and cyber spheres. There is a non-kinetic aspect to this, nation building, if you will, but it's really helping weak countries strengthen their own governance and not us doing it for them. But I had breakfast with a young lady from USAID this morning. We need more of that, and yet we have hobbled USAID by slashing its budget and reducing the numbers of Americans in that agency. There is a lot to do with understanding the culture and the populace on the ground, working with tribes, which we didn't want to work with initially in the Iraq War, working reconciliation with various political parties and movements on the ground. And this is something that we need to get a lot better at. When we were at our best during and shortly after the surge, we understood how the tribes of Al-Anbar province operated and who they were and what their concerns were. And we have lost that touch in places in the world today, Afghanistan and Syria among them. We have to work with detainees, because detainees can be one of two things. They can be fodder for the extremists in their midst. ISIS began arguably in a U.S. detention facility, where the extremists were able to proselytize others and create a movement. Until we learned that the detention facilities could be the greatest source of moderate missiles injected back into their communities if we worked with reconciliation programs in the detention centers. And all of these things, they work to squeeze the terrorist groups and all of the things that they need to operate. Squeeze their finances, squeeze their funding, their ideology, their popular support. It closes down their safe havens. I heard Admiral McRaven speak when I was here last, and he said that we need constant, unremitting pressure on these groups wherever they exist, and we cannot let up, and he is exactly right. And so if you want to know the way ahead in the war on terror, that should be it. And with that, I'd be happy to thank you for coming again, and I'd be happy to take